Good morning. My name is Rachel Clements, and I'm delighted to welcome you to day 3 of our virtual conference week and to this session on cybercrime protecting your firm. Now, we're shortly going to play back the recording of our live session from last week's conference, so you've got an opportunity to hear from our speakers, and that's going to take around 30 minutes. And afterwards, we'll be here to answer any questions that you might have. Now, we want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please do get your questions in. It's your chance to speak to representatives from the ICO, NCSC and the insurance industry, and of course the SRA, about anything you want to know about cyber risks and cybersecurity. So how can you get involved? Well, it's really easy. To ask a question, click on the link below this broadcast and submit your question. It's always nice to know your name, but you can submit questions anonymously if you prefer. And get this in as soon as possible, because we really want to make sure we get a chance to answer all of your questions during the broadcast. We're now going to run the video, and we'll see you shortly.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our compliance session on cybercrime. This is the 4th session, or 4th year running that we've run a cybercrime session, always very popular. Just to put it into context, we had about 10,000 views last year in the virtual session. So no pressure to the group, but I'll start by introducing the panel that we've got today. So first of all, my name is Robert Loughlin. I'm Executive Director of Operations at the SRA. I'm joined by James Moss, who is Legal Director at the Information Commissioner's Office. We've also got William Wright from Paragon Insurance, and we've got Mark, who is from the NCSC, Senior Representative. We've also got Rachel Clements from our regulatory management team, who will give an update on some of the issues we're seeing at the SRA. Before I start, can I just, I think most people have put their phones away, cameras. We are going to take pictures and we are going to video the session, but we've got at least one member of the panel that needs to keep their identity slightly separate. We won't be filming Mark during the session. I'd ask you to respect that throughout the session. So just moving into the session itself, we're going to have an action-packed session. We're going to cover everything from cybersecurity risks, information security, cyber insurance, reporting, trends and reports that we're seeing, and a link to guidance and resources that your firm might find useful. What we try to do this year is shake it up a little bit. We've brought people who you might engage with if you have an information security breach or a cyber attack. And certainly the organizations you should be thinking about and working with as you're preparing the ground for ensuring that you don't become susceptible to cyber attacks. And hopefully we're going to hear tips and suggestions from them today. From an SRA point of view, it's probably worth saying that not a lot has changed in the last year, certainly from a cyber point of view. It has changed greatly within the wider economy. We're seeing high inflation, energy costs, but one of the stable things that we're seeing is cybercrime continues, and it continues to be a menace and continues to have a massive impact on firms and wider society. The kind of key headlines for us are that while we are seeing the prevalence of cyber attacks in the news and so on, we are not seeing a huge increase in cyber attacks being reported to us. That's a really good thing, but as I said, we are still seeing a big prevalence in the news. There is a question for us about, are we seeing the level of reporting? So that's something that we are conscious of as an organisation, because as I said, we are seeing the news around cyber attacks continuing to grow. I think where we've seen particular interest recently is around the way in which firms are dealing with cyber and also how they're engaging with organisations like the ones we've got in front of us today. So I'm going to stop there. What we're going to do during the session is take some questions in a little while. I'm hoping to get through a few of those. We've also got a session on the 16th of November, a virtual session, where we're going to have more time to answer questions, and we'd really encourage people to come along to that. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to our first speaker. So hand over to James, who's going to give an update on the ICO work. James.
Thanks so much, Robert. Good afternoon, everyone. Bigger gig than I thought, but probably should have had the introduction emails. So I'm going to keep this fairly brief, so hopefully we do have a bit of time for questions at the end of the session. So in terms of, let's see, slides. There we go. So just as introductory remarks before I get into these, there's a cliche that I hear quite a lot when talking about these type of issues at the moment, which is there's two types of organisation, ones which have been subject to or have suffered a cyber attack, and ones that don't know they have yet. And from personal experience, that's pretty accurate. Before I did what I do now, I worked for DLA Piper, one of the largest law firms in the world, and I remember very distinctly being sat at my desk back in 2017, and all of a sudden the screen went black, and then a message came up in very 90s font which said, we have locked your system, please pay us $388 in Bitcoin to this address, have a nice day. And we'd been made subject to I think it was the WannaCry or the Petya, I think Petya, from have a look at the contemporary news reports at the time. And the impact of that was immediate. It went through the entire firm almost simultaneously, and we had no computers at all. And I distinctly remember asking somebody, do we still have a fax machine? Where is it and does it work? Because I have a court hearing. So from personal experience, this is very real and very serious in terms of impact on business. But the very next question, after you've answered the question, how am I going to do my job? How am I going to advise my clients? What on earth is going on? Is what am I going to do about my regulatory responsibilities? And one of the key things you will need to think about, of course, is reporting to the ICO, the Information Commissioner, which is why I'm here. So I'm hoping that most people are fairly familiar with the law. But the good news is if you're not, there's a very easy and good resource, which is our own website. There is a link, I think, which should be in some of the links which are provided as part of the notes to this presentation. But you can go straight onto our website and literally just type in, cyber attack, personal data breach is the word you want to use. And there's an interactive tool that you can type in, this is what's happened, or this is what we think or we know has happened thus far. And that will direct you to the right place to make the necessary report online. So it's a very simple and straightforward process. And I'd commend everyone have a look at that, or have your compliance people look at that in advance, so you're familiar with how it actually works in practice. Just as a brief nod to where the law is, if you're interested, and again, fairly straightforward, you're looking at Articles 33 and 34 of what's now UK GDPR. Article 33 is the one that says if you have a personal data breach, i.e. data is affected which relates to identified or identifiable natural persons, then you must report it within 72 hours to the ICO, unless, so it's a reverse burden if you like, there's unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. So the starting point is always if you have a personal data breach, i.e. a breach which affects information about people, your clients or your employees or whoever it may be, then you must tell us unless. And the unless threshold is something you'd want to think about carefully. Our general position is if in doubt, please do report it. I'll move on to the next slide, which is up here. A lot of the issues that we'll be touching upon today, and colleagues here will be touching upon today, to do with ransomware, because often cyber attacks are not just about the fact that you lose access to your personal data, but that people want money to give it back again. And then you have the million-dollar question is, well, what should we do about that, and what do our various regulatory and professional obligations say about that? And in brief, it is not encouraged, but as you'll hear from my colleague who's on next, it isn't always unlawful either. So it's a nuanced question about what we should be doing about that. Our public statement on this is on the web, so I'd commend people to have a look at that, and there should be a link to that as well at the end of the notes, which I've provided. One of the key questions we always get asked, and therefore I thought it useful perhaps to touch upon, is how do we know if we've had a personal data breach or not? Because we don't know if the people who have done this have got any data or not. What often happens is your system gets locked down and you can't access it, and then you start talking about something called exfiltration, which is basically a fancy word for saying has somebody taken the data or not. And often you can't immediately tell, and some people take the view, well, if we're not sure that any data has been exfiltrated and it's just been locked down, that's not a personal data breach, so we don't have to tell the ICO. Isn't that right? And the answer to that is, sorry, no, because lack of access to data or failure to be able to access data, even temporarily, is a reportable breach. I haven't put the citation for that because it's quite obscure. You have to dig quite far down into the European guidance, which we still follow or recommend as persuasive. But in essence, that's a very key thing to remember. If you lose access to personal data, that's exactly the same as if it was gone, and you still have to report it. So, just click on a bit. I'm not entirely convinced these are my slides. But anyway, here we go. So this is the citation there. It's the Article 29 Working Party Group Guidelines. When do I become aware? And again, this is an issue that people sometimes struggle with, which is, I think something's happened, but I'm not quite sure, and I don't know what's happened. So I'm going to keep digging until I'm sure, and then once I'm sure, I'll report it then. We generally take the view that we would prefer you to report earlier rather than later, and the general guidance says that aware is not restrictive. So as soon as you know something's happened, and more likely than not is probably your burden of proof if you want to look at it from that perspective, then that's the point at which it triggers the reporting requirement. And it is 72 hours. And again, minor point, but worth flagging, it's 72 hours as in hours on the clock. It's not 72 working hours. So if it happens on Christmas Day or Boxing Day, or it happens on a Friday night, you've still got 72 hours. Which is mitigated somewhat by the fact that you have to report it as soon as possible. And if you're not able, for whatever reason, to report it within 72 hours, you have to say why it took you longer in your report. So we will listen to those explanations, and if people are able to give us reasonable explanation of why it took longer than that, then we're, of course, prepared to consider that. So there are some notes and guidance here, but generally what I would say is this. If in doubt, err on the side of reporting. Reporting is easy. You can find the tools on our website. They're very straightforward. It's 72 hours on the clock, not 72 hours when your office is open. And in terms of what you are or aren't aware of, don't feel that you have to know everything about what's happened before you can report it. We're entirely happy for people to report things to us piecemeal with evidence of uncertainty. And with that, conscious of time, I'll pass on to William Wright is partner and director at Paragon International Insurance, and I think will be telling me about why it's a good idea to be insured against these risks, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Well, I mean, one item that does come up in my presentation is perhaps, talking of whether you're aware of a breach, at what point do you notify? Cyber insurance is very much a crisis management tool. It's there to help you and introduce you to a number of different third-party vendors who can help you handle an event and who will give you guidance, legal guidance on when the appropriate time is to notify and how to gather the information that you need in order to make a notification or indeed be sure that you should make a notification. So some of that ambiguity can indeed be resolved with insurance. So going to be rather naff, I'm afraid, and give you three stats just to start off. $6 trillion amounts to the global cyber losses to business in 2022. 98% of cyber risk still comes from human intervention or actions. And the average ransomware payment's $500,000. I'm not going to say payment, cost associated with a ransomware breach. This all came out of the Lloyd's Cyber Summit, which was held last week, and really just underlines and underscores the risk that faces business today, and obviously something that insurance attempts to transfer. The threat landscape hasn't really changed a great deal over the last 3 or 4 years in terms of the number of actors that are out there, the potential for severe outages, the potential for very large ransomware payments, the frequency. It's been a pretty bruising time, I'd say, for 2 or 3 years. If anything, we've probably seen a slowdown in the number of significant ransomware attacks in the last year, and that's possibly due to threat actors moving eastwards to the highest bidder in the unfortunate Ukraine-Russia conflict. So what are we going to touch on briefly in this presentation? What does insurance cover? The controls that the cyber insurance market look to underwrite to, which have changed a little bit over recent times. Very importantly, how claims are handled, and that gives you some inference on the process for notifying a claim, how you get the most out of an insurance policy, and ultimately make sure that you protected your business, and if you need to make a notification to the ICO, that you do it in the right way, and then how you can manage your risk around that. So what is cyber insurance? We put into 4 buckets: incident response, that's crisis management; hand-holding, essentially, introducing you to forensics experts, PR consultants, legal expertise in the event that you have a breach; extortion, ransomware, been around for a very, very long time, just the prevalence of it increased dramatically in 2017 onwards; lawsuits, privacy regulations, a lot of chat about GDPR a few years ago. Are fines insurable? I must have been asked that question about 5,000 times. Whether they're insurable or not, the lifespan of what starts out as a fine looks quite different by the time it gets paid out under an insurance policy. It's definitely not a fine anymore by the time that happens, and it's probably gone through some kind of commercial settlement. But the reality is that GDPR has been enforced quite frequently, and the insurance community has been put to work a number of times. Business interruption is a huge component of cyber insurance, paying for the loss of profits, the increased operational costs that your business suffers as a result of a cyber attack. And I think, as what James was describing, which is essentially wiperware, so your systems are essentially erased. Paying a ransom is irrelevant. You have to rebuild in that situation. And so business interruption is the key trigger there. Whereas WannaCry, which was much more designed around the crime pyramid, hacktivists at the bottom, organized crime as the next tranche up, and then it sort of narrows into terrorism and nation-state sponsored attacks at the top. The most prevalent part of that pyramid is really criminal organizations looking to gain financial advantage. So if they can't get your data and they can't do anything with it, then it's not worth a huge amount to them. NotPetya was unfortunate because it essentially was a byproduct of a different attack on a different set of businesses that spawned like a worm through lots of unwitting customers. So what's covered? I'm going to breeze through this part because I think hopefully there's some basic knowledge of what a cyber insurance policy might cover, and I've certainly just touched on a couple of those points. But it's important to remember that when we're covering liability, there's a difference between security breach liability and privacy liability. As businesses that are responsible for consumer or personal data, you are responsible for that data wherever it sits, whether it's one of your employees leaving a laptop on a train, whether it's a vendor of yours happens to have the breach and not you. Oh, I outsourced my credit card data to a third-party payment processor. Ultimately, it's your client who's going to come to you first. And so an insurance policy will respect that. It may well try to subrogate after the fact, but insurance policy is there to protect your liability from a data breach. Network security breaches that don't involve people's data, but perhaps involve downtime, that starts straying more into professional services, so that might cross over a bit more with your PI policy. Cyber insurance isn't an all risks policy, it's a named perils policy, so we're talking about a computer attack, a system damage, a system outage, a business interruption event, that type of thing. Assets, we're talking about a data, very important that money is not considered data. There are some cyber policies that will cover you for something akin to theft of funds, but fundamentally most cyber insurance isn't designed to do that. It will certainly protect you for social engineering claims, where someone has impersonated your business to transfer funds to another party. So in 2019, the loss ratios, I'm going to give the Lloyd's of London picture anyway, rather than the global cyber insurance market. Loss ratios went from under 100% to over 100%. So that in 2020, we were categorically a loss-making industry, which when you think that there are billions of pounds of premium being paid through this business model, and it's not making any money, and our fundamental job is to be there for the next claim, this was a serious problem. Capital slowed down, Lloyd's had to clamp down on the amount of premium that syndicates could write, and as a result, underwriting processes hardened. They became much more stringent. And cyber insurance is fundamentally a reactive industry. So what you can see on the screen here are some of the absolute benchmark requirements that we would expect our customers and clients to have in place in order to get the best possible insurance product. I'm going to just pick a few out here because there's obviously quite a few on there. But MFA, if you don't have MFA implemented for remote access into your network, you're probably not going to be able to get cyber insurance. And I'm not saying that lightly. we've had a number of clients that have had to implement that type of technology to be able to maintain insurance. And then I think the other two, backups are hugely important, keeping those segregated from your network, making sure that you've got at least 2 backups, one that you can fall back on in the event of a ransomware attack or a breach, is really, really important to ensure that your business can get back up and running as quickly as possible. And then training. Don't click the link. I think that's still, I mean, we'll just say 95% of all cyber events that we see are human-related, and phishing is a very, very prevalent means of getting into people's networks. So I'd say that those 3, MFA, training, and backups, are absolutely critical. So you bought a cyber insurance policy, you've got through those hurdles, you've got a potential event on your hands. What do you do? I would break it into 3 buckets. You've either got data, extortion, or systems. So in the case of DLA, they had a system failure. The systems all went down. It happened to be related to a ransomware event, but in that case, it's all hands to the pump. You've got to get legal involved, you've got to get compliance involved, you've got to get the regulatory team involved, you've got to get IT forensics involved, you've definitely got to get PR involved, because you don't want to say the wrong thing to the press. So that really is doomsday. And depending on whether you're looking at a data incident or whether you're looking at a systems incident, that might infer, do I go to a legal advisor first, or do I go to an IT forensics provider first? I can speak from Paragon's own product. We tend to lean on the side of caution and have Clyde & Co., a legal representative, as our incident response triage service, so that right from the beginning there's legal privilege in place for data in the event that it has been compromised. But if there's actually really no data compromise involved and it's a system issue, then they can divert traffic onto the appropriate provider, which this would be on the far right-hand side, the forensics column. So important to note that the second that you are about to spend money on a retainer, that is really, from an insurance perspective, the moment that you must have notified the policy. So we'd probably recommend going a couple of steps before that. And once you've had it put through the food chain in the business and enough people know that there's a problem, you should be calling the hotline that will hopefully come with your insurance product, and that will engage all of these services. I'm going to skip through these because I'm mindful of time. The role of the broker has changed quite a bit too, because of the changing loss environment, because of those loss trends that impacted the way that insurance was bought, the cost of it, the availability of it. We've had to evolve ourselves a little bit and become more consultative. So I'm only talking from my company's perspective, but I know that many other expert brokers in this space will be doing something similar, trying to offer you as customers more than just an insurance product. So we use some perimeter scanning technology with one of our partners called Kind. We do limit modeling with Cybercube to make sure that you're buying the appropriate limits. We use BitSight and can leverage that on behalf of our customers to do vulnerability scanning on vendor networks. And then, of course, we make sure that we have an IT firm on hand that can come in and do some work to educate and help you understand what your cyber risks could look like. So whether it's, I'm not going to go into that one, whether it's making sure that you've got the right risk management protocols in place, fundamentally, this all gets pulled in by insurance. The policy language is very broad. It's a highly available product. You get a lot out of it very quickly. I think anybody that's been buying for the last 4 years has probably seen the pricing go up a fair bit, but it'd be very difficult to turn around in this day and age when you know what the threat landscape looks like. I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit more about that, and say that it's not a worthwhile risk management spend. So hopefully that was a whistle-stop tour of how cyber insurance can help you. And I'm now going to pass on to Rachel Clements, Regulatory Manager with the SRA.
Thank you, William. I'm just going to cover off a few things that you need to know really from an SRA perspective. And I think the first thing to say, as Robert mentioned right at the beginning really, is that overall we're seeing a really improving picture in terms of the reports that we're receiving and also the number of instances that we're hearing about. So with that in mind, let's look at some of the current trends and reports that we have received from you this year. Firstly, looking in terms of client money and client losses, as you can see from our graph, over the last 5 to 6 years, estimated client losses have generally decreased each year from a really significant high number of over 10 million in 2017 to this year, we're looking about £700,000 in client losses up until October. Crucially, however, this figure was just a result of 9 cyber attacks, and every single one of them was from email modification fraud. And of course, as Robert mentioned, trends in reports are also decreasing, but of course we can't say for sure that this is because there are less attacks happening in firms. You'll also notice from the graph here that last year figures do seem to be bucking the trend in 2021, and that figure was at 2.3 million in client losses, but just over half of that sum was stolen in just one conveyancing transaction, which really does show, why criminals really are focusing on conveyancing transactions in particular. And in fact, the vast majority of attacks last year, as you can see on our next slide, over 78% in fact targeted conveyancing, and a huge 98% of that figure was stolen using modified emails, of course with bogus bank account details. I think, therefore, as usual, the message is that the biggest threat to firms and clients continues to be found in your inboxes. And phishing emails provided the gateway to those attacks in the vast majority of instances we saw. And of course, with increasing property prices and even better cyber defenses and off-the-shelf phishing kits, we know that phishing is a real concern for most firms. And what we've also seen is that it's usually clients that tend to be targeted when most firms are attacked. So I thought it might be useful if we can have a look at an example of a typical report that we received this year into our investigation and supervision department. So in our case study, a firm emailed our report line to say that they'd asked their client for their deposit monies for their property purchase, and unfortunately the client concerningly said, "I've already paid it." So the firm obviously carried out some investigations, and they produced a copy of their report and an email that the client had purportedly received from the firm. Now, this showed that the firm's name in their email address and in their firm logo in an email had been changed almost undetectably by changing an M to an N. I would say that timing also seemed to be key in this case because the real fee earner was on holiday at the time, so it suggests that these emails were being monitored for some time. Now, the client was asked to pay their deposit of £50,000 to some new bank account details, of course. Interestingly, though, when they tried, it bounced. So the client asked for some new bank account details, that bounced too. They asked for more bank account details, each time with a different company name, with a different bank account that didn't seem to have any association with the firm at all. And each time, this didn't alert the client until finally and eventually their payment was successful. Now, investigation by the firm's insurers have identified that the attack had originated from a phishing email which had been opened by the fee earner. Now, the firm were resolving this with their client, and overall were really satisfied with everything that they had done. I thought one of the interesting things, though, is that they produced a copy of their client care letter, which had on it in bold letters, in capitals, and underlined with warning, do not skip this bit. Now, of course, that's really salient advice. But I think another piece of salient advice would also be that even with such alerts, people do often forget about cybersecurity. People don't notice these things. They don't always notice the obvious. So I really would say make it a priority just to regularly remind clients throughout the transaction about these risks, particularly in conveyancing transactions. Because just like the email address on this slide, your emails may not always be as they seem. Now, I don't know whether you noticed that we had modified our email address, if anyone spotted that we'd spoofed it. Did anyone? Anyone admit it? I'm sure most of you did, but if you didn't, I think this just shows it's really quite easy to skip the obvious bit. But client money isn't the only thing at risk when a criminal intercepts your systems, as William pointed out earlier. Your information is also very valuable, and data breaches, we know, are also increasing, and we have received another handful of ransomware attacks this year. A taste of some of the real-life reports that we received this year included a well-known ransomware gang known as Hive, who publicized their professional services on Google and encouraged their victims, the firm, to try and negotiate a ransom with them through a portal. Another example of a really sophisticated attack that we heard about was reported by a large firm who discovered that their network had been accessed by a unique form of intrusion, so not ransomware this time or phishing, and key email accounts belonging to senior partners were all targeted. But they weren't focused on money or personal data. They were focused on corporate information, sensitive commercial information that they could use for corporate espionage. And also they had some Russian connections, so some interesting connections there with our concerns earlier about the Ukraine. However, sophisticated attacks like that tend to be really rare in the reports that we see. And crucially, the research suggests that most data breaches are really a result of human error. And that's why phishing emails, of course, are so effective. So in terms of basic cyber defenses, we would say that you should always think really holistically about this. So think about your people, your systems, and your controls. In terms of systems, having the ICO here is a reminder really that, unfortunately a firm was fined this year, unfortunately quite a high amount because they didn't have basic security measures in place. So again, something that we would say that if you do have limited resources, to always target those in the areas where you might think you might be most vulnerable. So moving on and focusing on some wider regulatory risks highlighted this year. I know personally from reviewing firms for our thematic review that recovering from ransomware attacks can take a considerable amount of time, money, and stress. But in conjunction with the ICO and the NCS's warnings letter to the profession earlier this year, we would also like to stress that we recommend that firms don't pay any ransoms. Not only are you essentially paying a criminal, for their services and all of the risks that entails, but quite simply, in practical terms, doing so could really expose you, your firm, and your clients to additional risk. In fact, further research shows that it doesn't pay to pay. Or as a colleague beautifully put it to me, you might as well set your money on fire. Because according to research, over 80% of businesses who did make a payment experienced a further attack, and over half of those thought that it was actually the same attacker. And of course, there's no guarantee that you might get your data back anyway. So we would say, don't be a target. Do focus on those low-cost strategies to make those payments unnecessary in the first place. So I think, we've already had some good advice on that, but think about your disaster recovery plans and backups and storage and instant responses. And finally, this year we also investigated a very small number of third-party complaints that indicated that clients hadn't been informed about cyber attacks, and that reports hadn't been made to us about cyber attacks. This included a firm telling staff not to tell their clients about a ransomware attack because the data had only been encrypted and not extracted. I think we've already heard why that isn't the case, and obviously it's always better that clients hear from you about whether a cyber attack has happened to your firm, particularly as some of these things do end up going in the press as they did this year. But more importantly, we would say that this could also be a breach of your duty to disclose material information to your clients. It's also really important that you report to us as well, both, of course, as a regulatory obligation, but also so that we can warn others, just like we are today. And in fact, we issued 50 warnings on our scam alerts line just in the last 3 months, and those were purely from the reports that you sent in to us. I think ultimately, just to finish off, I would say a positive cybersecurity culture really does rely on openness and transparency. And it relies on your team feeling confident that they can make reports to you and that you'll do the right thing with that information. And of course, when we receive those reports from you, we'll also take that into account. Thank you. And I'll just pass you on to Mark from the NCSE.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark. I'm from the NCSE. I'm here to brief you on some updates and to talk about some of the resources that we have. So the NCSE is a part of GCHQ, the UK Technical Authority for Cyber Threats. We are not a regulator. We aim to provide support and guidance to critical organisations, public sector, industry, SMEs, and the citizens in the UK. As you can see from this diagram, our structure is made up of 4 directorates: policy and communications, technical research and innovation, which includes cyber growth, our capabilities, engineering, operations, which is where our incident management takes place, cyber operations, and cyber assessments. We work closely with GCHQ in this area to work and manage all the incidents that are reported to us. Within the National Resilience and Strategy section, We cover legal, delivery, and strategy aspects. As you can see as well from the diagram, economy and society is an area where we look at the citizens, industry, outside of critical national infrastructure, and we work closely with organizations to improve their cybersecurity posture. So I'm going to cover these areas you can see on the screen. You've heard from my colleagues today around ransomware and the threats and the problems, supply chain, a few updates from the NCSE, and also a report that we're working on at this moment to update and provide more guidance. So ransomware is currently the most significant cyber threat faced by UK businesses across almost all sectors that we work with. There's been a steady increase in attacks on UK organisations over this past year. For criminals, it's a highly effective business model, as they often operate with impunity from locations where our ability to pursue is limited, so areas such as Russia and other states. The trends in ransomware that we're seeing at the moment are ransomware as a service, hack and leak, double, treble extortion, with different techniques being used. Our colleagues have mentioned that we, as the NCSE, advise never to pay a ransom because it can lead to further attacks, and we see this quite often. So from the screen, these are some of the actions that we tend to advise. So in terms of RDP protocol, we would say in certain circumstances, you can turn this off, or you can add MFA. We also advise to patch against known vulnerabilities. Patching is something that is always advised, especially in the IT world, but it's very crucial to ransomware. Preventing against malware spreading across your systems is, again, a very important area. And backing up of data, which everyone has mentioned, has been a consistent theme and advice that we'd always push. So I mentioned supply chain cybersecurity. This is a real difficult area because there's a significant increase in the number of cyber attacks resulting from vulnerabilities within your supply chain. It's an area that's quite difficult to understand the landscape because you can outsource your IT, you can outsource various systems, and these are where some of the threats can come. And they can have devastating and sometimes long-term ramifications for organizations. So as you can see from the slide, threat actors target supply chain, seeking easier access. We've seen some examples in 2015, Sony Pictures, in 2017, Operation Cloud Hopper, and in 2017, WannaCry, which we've also heard about. There's many sophisticated cyber attacks taking place these days at scale. And we've seen, again, some examples, SolarWinds you may have heard about, Sunburst, and Log4j compromises. As I mentioned earlier, the supply chain is a difficult area for us to manage and evaluate the risks because companies often outsource their IT services, and also it's very hard to distinguish between tiers where the attack has taken place. The NCSE this year, on the 12th of October, launched some new guidance aimed at all organizations on how they can set up a framework to assess and gain confidence in their supply chain security. So there's some links that come with this pack which you can follow up on from our website. The guidance builds upon NCSE's 12 principles of supply chain. So just going to cover a few of the updates that we've had recently. I'm not sure if you're aware of Cyber Essentials. This is something that's a government-backed scheme to help organizations protect themselves from common cyber attacks. We do recommend Cyber Essentials because it has many of the controls, basic controls, that can prevent and reduce some of the cyber attacks that you could face. So this year we published, again, I think last month, we published an update around some of the myths around Cyber Essentials, because we've had a lot of feedback from organizations where they're having difficulties obtaining the certification, whether that's through lack of understanding or maybe just the size of the organization. So I'm just going to cover a few key points from that page, which has got more advice on Cyber Essentials. There are also some new updates and new changes coming to Cyber Essentials in January. So as you can see from the slide, scoping, ideally, we would advise you would have your whole IT infrastructure in scope. However, we understand that's not always easy with complex systems. So if you define a subset of your target system, you can obtain certification from that scope. Bring your own device. Everyone's aware of this, and obviously due to the pandemic, the increase in people using their own devices to access their organization systems has increased significantly. But this is not a new requirement. Any end-user device is within scope. Legacy software. This is a problem for all organizations across all sectors. Sometimes some of the legacy software that you're using is a bit difficult to remove. So what we say, remove where possible, and if not, segregate outside of scope. Security updates. I mentioned before about protecting against and patching against vulnerabilities. There is a 14 days expected time frame. However, this only applies to internet-connected devices under certain circumstances. Some of those being updating fixes with a high-risk vulnerability, updating addresses, update address vulnerability with common vulnerability scores above 7, and where there's updates where there's no details of a level of vulnerability, and the update fixes provided by the vendor. Just to finish off on this section, we've got some statistics, there's quite a few you can see on the website, but the key one I wanted to pull out was organizations that are certified with Cyber Essentials are deemed more cyber resilient. Underwriter data as well has told us that these same organizations are 60% less likely to make an insurance claim. One of our free services, Early Warning Service, is a free threat notification service. It informs organizations about potential suspicious activity. It helps them by filtering correlation and sending specific warnings to an organization. You can sign up to this service, it's free. Check it out on our website. We've recently got a new feature, which again was published on a recent blog. It's called the Admiralty Scale. It's also known as the NATO system. So this is a new standard we're using for our early warning service to enable us to provide better reliability from the intelligence sources we receive, and then sending that information out to our customers. And finally, I mentioned the cyber threat to the UK legal sector report. So in 2018, we created a report alongside the industry 100s within the legal sector. The feedback was really successful, and the target areas or the threats we covered were ransomware, phishing, data breaches. But this time around, we are looking to focus on those areas, but also to add loss of data, supply chain compromise, financially motivated attacks, and remote working. We're also planning to include the impact to organizations, covering the loss of client data that you've heard about, ICO fines that you could be subject to, and the reputational damage. As well as that, we're going to cover and provide actions for organizations to take following the 10 steps to cybersecurity, as well as assisting to help you implement training and awareness within your organizations. Again, talking about backing up your systems, which is really crucial, protecting from malware, and improving your identity and access management.
you're on mute, Rachel.
Sorry about that. Welcome back, and we hope you found that a helpful, informative session. We're now here with our panelists, and that includes me. I'm Rachel Clements, a regulatory manager at the SRA. And as you might have noticed, I'm doubling up as a chair today, as unfortunately Robert isn't available. But the good news is that we do have our panel of industry experts with us. And just to briefly introduce them again, we've got James Moss, Director of Legal Services at the ICO, William Wright, Partner and Director at Paragon International Insurance Brokers, and Mark, a Senior Representative at the NCSC. Now, we've had quite a few questions through already, but just to let you know, there is still time to ask more questions. So you can just submit them using the link again below this broadcast. And it would be really great to see some more questions, and so we can try and get through as many of them as possible today. But to start off, we've had quite a few questions from people. So thank you, Emma, Amanda, and Robert, about sort of low-cost options people can use. So small to medium firms with perhaps not very much capital, where they can go to buy products and support. And I think that's really probably a critical question that comes up quite a lot for so many firms, really where to target their resources effectively. And of course, that's probably where, they might be most vulnerable. So perhaps if I can turn to you, Mark, first of all, to answer that question.
Okay, yeah. So around products and services that small business and small to medium businesses can use, we would advise if you follow the small business guide. So on the NCSC website, we have a small business guide, and within that small business guide, there are tips to reducing the chance of becoming a victim of cyber attacks. Some tips on and some material around online training, which you can embed into your existing training or create new training packages, which will improve the awareness for things like phishing, which I mentioned in my presentation. Because what we do find is small organizations and large organizations often suffer from an initial basic attack. So if you have those basic controls in place, which aren't costly, this can really help. We also have things such as the early warning service, which I mentioned also in the presentation, and that helps. That's a free threat notification service. So that with that service, you get, as it says in the name, early warning, which can help you to protect your systems. So I'd say definitely check out our small business guide, because there's many tips in there, and there's other tools such as exercise in a box, which can help you really understand where your threats are coming from and how to protect and implement some simple controls which are not costly.
Very good advice. And William, is there anything that you can add to that at all?
I think that's a pretty concise overview from Mark. From an insurance perspective, there are a few things that we always look out for. MFA, the MFA on remote access is hugely important. But also, if you're using Microsoft, there are a huge number of tools that are available from Microsoft that are free. It's not costly to implement MFA. In many cases, it's free. Email filtering, web filtering, these are all services that can be provided by the O365 suite. So if you do have that, that's quite an easy fix. And then also reach out to your insurance provider, your insurance broker. A lot of the SME platforms will work on an attestation basis. They'll list out 10 or 12 things, and that's a really nice benchmark for what certainly the insurance industry thinks is a quality standard. And then you can work out which items on there are easy to fix, cheap to fix, or out of budget.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. We've also just had a few more questions coming in, and I think they all seem to be touching on fairly similar sort of areas. We've had a question in, and it's about, and this is from Eddie, and they've asked if it's sufficient or advised to rely on cloud for backing up. I think this is something that we've had last year, and I suppose people sort of wondering about how to really make sure that they are protected. If particularly in cases of ransomware, how can they make sure that they have got proper backup and storage, and are able to recover, and if the worst happens, and how they make sure that actually the storage companies are reliable. perhaps that's something perhaps for Mark initially.
Thanks, Rachel. So again, our advice, it all comes within the same small business guide, and the advice on backing up data is as simple as taking regular backups of your important data and testing that they can be restored. So looking at your business continuity policies and actually how that would work, and actually running through those scenarios. Because as we've moved, especially since the pandemic, and we've moved towards more working from home and more cloud-based systems, the only way you're going to really know how you can recover from an attack or recover from an incident is to actually test and run through your BC plans and be quite comprehensive with that. Other advice we've given around backups is just ensuring that the device containing your backup is not permanently connected to the network, for example, because again, that's where you become totally reliant on those cloud services, and that could also ensure that, or also end up with you not being able to restore your data. So that's really sort of the basic advice that we would give. We wouldn't really advise on saying which vendors to use around backups, but we'd just say take regular backups and actually run through those scenarios as opposed to waiting for something to happen.
And would you or any of the rest of the panel say, is there anything that you can do, in terms of due diligence, just to sort of check, that you are, that who you provide, what the risks there might be, and what you might need to check when thinking about cloud storage?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is where this feeds in a bit into our supply chain guidance, and why there's been a new blog that was published recently, because that's ensuring that the controls that your supply chain are using are following the same steps that you in your organization will be following. So if you again check out that guidance, because there's some key tips, some basic advice which can really help you ensure that your cloud providers and your supply chain are using those controls, just to ensure you don't suffer those attacks.
Anyone else like to add anything?
There's probably one basic thing here, which is like Mark was just saying, you're checking to make sure that they follow the same rules and guidance and processes that you do. So hold them to the same standard that you hold yourself to. If your MFA provider is in the cloud and they can't give you if your backup provider is in the cloud and they can't give you MFA protection to accessing those backups, that's a big red flag. So it's certainly worth A, checking whether your vendor has insurance, and B, making sure that the same sorts of security that you place on yourself is matched by what they offer.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you, William. So we're just getting some more questions through, and as I mentioned, we have got quite a few people obviously really concerned about perhaps third-party risks, as we've just talked about. We've had another question through about does anybody have any thoughts on the specific risks and benefits to outsourcing your IT? Now, this is something, just to say, that we had come up in our thematic review, and one of the issues that we found is that it's obviously absolutely fine to have to outsource your IT, and indeed that helps you to focus on your business. But perhaps one of the things is to make sure that as a firm that you're completely still, but cybersecurity is still your responsibility essentially, and that you're really aware of what's happening and you're making sure that you're keeping on top of it, because obviously issues can happen still. Does anybody else here on the panel have any further sort of thoughts about any specific risks? Oh, and of course, the benefits of having IT support, particularly, I suppose, for small firms.
Just from the regulatory perspective, worth pointing out that if you are outsourcing in that way, probably the relationship is going to be with you as controller and the outsourcing company as process director on your behalf. So the data protection liability sadly doesn't pass to them. You still have to ensure that their data security is appropriate, because they're acting on your behalf. Which is not to say it's not a good idea to sort of get specialists to manage these things for you, but that's just an element of risk from that regulatory perspective. It's worth keeping an eye on.
Okay, that's great. So Thank you for everybody still putting your questions in. We're getting quite a few through, so that's great. So we've now got a question. This is from Samantha, and she's asking, are there any specific areas of training you'd advise to get prioritised for staff? And I was just wondering whether, I mean, that's probably about, you know, culture, isn't it? And really, and we're all talking about a cybersecurity culture and about how important it is really to put people first and have that sort of holistic view of cybersecurity. I was going to say that we also know that, and as I mentioned in my presentation, people do forget, don't they, about cybersecurity, and things do happen and people don't follow their policies, for example. So has anybody got any thoughts about the sort of specific areas of training you might want to get prioritised for staff? And probably as an additional to that, you know, how often should you do it just to make sure that, you know, these messages really are sticking? Would anybody on the panel like to answer that?
So from an NCSC perspective, we have a vast amount of training packages that are on our website. We do some work with individual sectors to try and tailor training and awareness within continuous professional development programs. So, for example, I'm currently working with the accountancy sector at the moment around some specific training courses that they can embed into their packages, and also with the Law Society and Bar Council around the training that's been delivered. Rachel's point around the frequency of training, you really want to embed your training in as a regular feature. So how you have to update your training on data protection, for example, you want to be trying to ensure that cyber security training is also reviewed, possibly on an annual basis at the very least, I would say. That's not an actual line from the NCSC, but we would advise regularly reviewing your training and your awareness, because you're also then going to factor in new starters, as well as people that have moved into different departments in your organisations. And there was also a mention around our cyber. I want to mention as well our cyber awareness campaign, because within those campaigns we talk about things around MFA. MFA being multi-factor authentication, moving away from your standard generic passwords, so having different passwords using 3 random words, for example.
That's really good advice, yeah. And I think sometimes people do just really want to understand the basics, don't they? You know, what are the basics to help firms be protected? You know, multi-factor authentication and patching, those sort of things. So, and how to train people to make sure that they understand what the risks are. So that's really good advice. Does anybody else want to answer any further questions about training, or just indeed about how to embed things into your culture? Sorry.
2 things, Rachel. One is just to go a little bit further on MFA, just because from the insurance perspective, it's important. MFA would have to be 3 points at least of, it would be some kind of username, some kind of password, and then a randomly generated token. And it's that last randomly generated token bit that's really important, because for a lot of insurance companies, they will expect authenticator or some kind of randomly based token to be generated for MFA to have been applied properly, not just email and random password on the basis that your email address and your random password can be hacked. So that's a key distinction. And on the training, there are quite a lot of effective free phishing exercises that you can download and use from the internet. And there are some more advanced ones that certainly we use with our clients. There's plenty of free tutorials and free programs available for phishing exercises.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Just moving on now. So we've had some more questions, and this one is from Michelle. And Michelle's asking about where she can get more up-to-date information on scams. I think this is a really good question, and again, something that has come up before, where people really need to know, you know, what they need to be aware of. And that's one of the reasons that we always talk about at the SRA, what sort of reports that we receive, so people can be aware of the risks out there. I think that's probably one I can answer straight away, in the fact that, of course, as I mentioned again in my presentation, we do have a scam alert line. That is something that we often we get directly reports from you, from the profession and from consumers about concerns that we've had, usually about bogus firm names and spoof email addresses, that sort of thing. And we even introduced one ourselves, so you might have heard about it. The SRA also received a phishing email, and that's something that we will put out on our scam alerts. And again, as I talked, we receive those regularly, so we've had hundreds and hundreds a year. So, it's definitely worth checking out our website and having a look at our scam alerts. Of course, there is also other information. I know that the ICO and also the NCSE also share information about things that you might need to be aware of in terms of current cyber attacks or current scams. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about that, perhaps either James or Mark. Perhaps Mark?
Yes, sorry, I was going to say probably more Mark's side than ours. I think we have plenty of information about what to do if it happens, but less about how it tends to be happening.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I kind of missed what you said, Rachel. What's the last part of what you said?
I was just really wondering, I was just really wondering whether the SCNC actually produce any information, up-to-date information about what sort of scams or concerns that people might need to be aware of. So, for example, any particular ransomware attacks or anything like that?
We don't tend to publish in terms of actual names and actors as such on our website, but we do on our website we do have a suspicious email that you can actually suspicious email address that you can actually send any suspicious emails to, and also our suspicious text number, and usually from that we can remove and take down services. We also have an NCSC takedown service, which also provides that. So there are relationships that we have with organisations where we, via something called our trust groups, where we can provide in-depth information on actual threats and where some of these scams are coming from. But in the wider, broader landscape, we usually don't tend to publish that information. It's quite broad in terms of what we publish on our website on scams, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel, one thing to add there is that there are some insurers out there. One would be CFC, who I'm sure will be familiar to a number of the audience, who provide regular CVE, so that's common vulnerabilities and exposures scanning. So there's a list of all of the current common vulnerabilities that are being exploited by hackers on a frequent basis, and that list is available to a number of insurers and a number of brokers, and scans can be run pretty easily on network-facing, internet-facing architecture. So.
Thank you.
And just to add to William's point, actually, that is partly what the early warning service does. It has all that information. So actually, if organisations have signed up to the early warning service, they will get the threat information directly to their organisation. So thank you for that, William.
Yeah, and just to say as well, in addition to all of that really helpful information and guidance as well, we also have our risk outlook at the SRA. And although it's not as often as the scam alerts, so you'll see those up-to-date warnings about risks that are happening right now. The risk outlook will also talk about sort of the current risks that we're seeing in reports so more regularly. And of course, we'll always try and update you in our conferences as well of anything that we think that firms do need to know. Just to start, before we wrap up, we've just got one last question. I think it's probably a question that we can all contribute to. It's our final question. And the question is about if a firm does pay a ransom or advises a client to pay one, is this a breach of SRA or other rules? And I think, of course, this touches upon both the letter from the ICO and the NCSC and sort of information about data breaches. And we've obviously all come out and said that we do recommend that firms don't pay ransoms. Just to say, from our point of view as the SRA, there is no specific breach of SRA regulations that would constitute by advising someone to pay a ransom. So that's probably the first thing to say. However, as we sort of intimated during our presentation again at the conference, that does expose you to potentially other risks. And of course, there are other potential, illegalities, as well as paying sort of criminals. Potentially, you might be, exposing yourself to other legal issues around, for example, terrorist financing, AML issues, also, potentially, proceeds of crime. So there are potentially some, criminal aspects to this that firms need to be aware of, whether, it's specifically breaching SRA rules. That isn't necessarily the case, but as I mentioned, I think one of the main points is really just to be aware that this, isn't advisable. I think, and the NCSA reiterated that, as did you, James, and because of the risks, and of course that, that you still need to make a report to the breach, and you still would need to recover your systems in most cases. I don't know if anyone else can add anything further to that, just to answer that question.
Yeah, so I think from the NCSC perspective, that one of the reasons why we still stick with that advice around ransomware is just because of some of the trends we've seen. So it's turning into ransomware as a service, this hack and leak trend, double and treble extortion. So although you've paid the ransom, they still then leak your data, or they still hold you to ransom again. So we do really try to stick with that advice, because the trends we're seeing, this is what essentially you're enabling criminals to actually assist them to attack you again, or look for other organizations who are likely to pay the ransom.
Good advice. And anybody else want to add anything?
I'll add something briefly, just to be devil's advocate, because on the insurance side, we don't take a line that advises people not to pay ransoms or to give them that kind of a guidance. They can take that from regulators and from their own internal policies. Our job is to be there and help you if you do choose to pay the ransom. If you choose not to, but you need to negotiate with the ransom attacker. If you choose to ignore the ransomware entirely, there's a whole series of logical infrastructural checks, balances, forensics reviews, audits that will need to happen in the event that there is a ransomware event. But we want to make sure that as much of that is covered by insurance as possible, whether or not you choose to pay the ransom. And so I would just be mindful that don't try and, because you're not going to pay it, don't just ignore it. Or if you think that you are going to pay it, don't do that. Obviously, get other people who are experts in the field involved early, irrespective of what outcome you hope or don't hope for.
And just, I think, finally, from our perspective, I mean, as a regulator, we remain, I suppose, broadly neutral, but not massively in favour, is probably the best summary of our position, albeit interesting perspective I heard from someone else in the insurance market recently, that in reality, given the anti-money laundering, terrorist financing risks that you inevitably run if you attempt to pay this type of payment, actually it ends up being fairly challenging to do it lawfully, even if you want to. And that's, I think, going to be a particular concern for the legal sector, because of all the regulatory requirements that come from operating a law firm, and the serious consequences of not getting your AML and sanctions compliance right. So it's even where it's theoretically possible, I think assessing the risk of confirming that it will be lawful to make such a payment to the relevant recipients is going to be a difficult challenge, and perhaps one that you don't want to run the risk on. But of course, that's not a matter that we regulate. It's just worth flagging.
I think that's, those are all really interesting perspectives. And I think, that's obviously goes back to when firms are considering their cybersecurity, it is about your whole business, isn't it? And, you do need to carry out a risk assessment and think about, plan and prepare for your approach. And obviously, some of those risks may be just too significant to take. And that's something that firms need to consider and decide. But just to say that we're always available if you do need advice as a firm. We've got our ethics helpline here as well, and also other sources of support. So, if you are concerned and confused about what to do in that situation, we would always recommend that you seek advice first, as you mentioned. So that's really helpful. Thank you. But I think that's probably, we've probably reached the end of our Q&A session. But so just leave me to say, thank you to everybody. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to you for asking questions. It's always really, helpful to understand what you're concerned about. And then I'm sorry if we didn't get to any of the questions that you wanted to ask. We'll look at them and see if there's anything that we can pick up in future webinars to answer them. Again, and of course, as we mentioned, you can also ask Ethics Helpline as well if you need some further support. Hopefully you found that was a really good session, but we really do want to know what you think. Did this format work for you? How could we improve it? If you do want to leave some feedback, please do, and leave it on the link below and let us know what your views are. Just let you know finally that there are some further sessions this week, so please do visit the SRA events page for further information, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive further notifications about other sessions when they're live. But for now, thank you so much, and thank you to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.